Imagine being a champion for disability rights, only to have your own mobility brutally attacked by the very people who vowed to uphold community standards. I remember the day vividly, as if every detail was etched in my mind, a day that shattered the calm of a seemingly idyllic community. It began like any other morning in the upscale gated enclave of Suncrest Estates, where meticulously manicured lawns and pristine homes painted a picture of suburban bliss. But behind that veneer, a storm was brewing, a storm that would forever change the life of Judge Robert Caldwell, a man whose dedication to disability rights was legendary. Judge Caldwell was not an ordinary resident. Appointed early to the federal bench because of his groundbreaking work in disability law, his rulings had paved the way for millions of Americans to live with dignity and equal rights. Diagnosed with multiple sclerosis years ago, his mobility had gradually diminished, but his spirit remained unbroken. Determined to maintain his independence, he invested in a custom-built titanium wheelchair, an instrument of both mobility and dignity. This wasn't just any wheelchair, it was a state-of-the-art piece of equipment, designed specifically for someone battling the physical challenges of MS. When he chose to downsize and move into Suncrest Estates, a community celebrated for its accessible, single-level homes and its promise of an elegant, maintenance-free lifestyle, everyone believed he had found the perfect sanctuary. The neighborhood was marketed to retired professionals seeking a serene life, and on paper, it was ideal for someone in Caldwell's situation. After all, the homes featured wide doorways, gentle slopes instead of stairs, and even promised expedited access to nearby medical services. However, as with many stories, the initial promise of perfection soon gave way to a disturbing reality. Shortly after his move, Caldwell received a crisp white envelope taped to his front door. The envelope bore the Suncrest Estates logo and carried a violation notice. His professionally installed accessibility ramp had been deemed an unauthorized exterior modification. It was a minor detail that should have been overlooked, but for Caldwell, it was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Enter Valerie Harmon, the sharply dressed and impeccably groomed HOA president. With a clipboard in hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, she arrived at his door the very next morning. "Welcome to Suncrest Estates," she said with a tone that dripped with rehearsed warmth. Her words, however, barely concealed a deep-seated disdain. "Your entryway, while functional, disrupts our community's aesthetic standards," she declared. When Caldwell explained that his modifications were protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, Valerie's expression hardened. "The ad doesn't supersede our covenant," she snapped, dismissing his concerns with a wave of her manicured hand. What followed was not a one-time disagreement, but a relentless campaign of harassment. Valerie began issuing a barrage of violation notices for even the most minor modifications. His wheelchair-accessible van was labeled a commercial vehicle under the community's rules. A small bird feeder that provided him with a moment of simple joy was deemed a wildlife nuisance. Even his automated blinds, installed out of necessity due to his limited arm mobility, were flagged as unapproved modifications. Each notice, each fine, was a calculated move designed not only to intimidate, but also to force him out. It wasn't long before Caldwell discovered that he wasn't the only victim. In hushed conversations over coffee in the community's common area, he learned of similar stories. An elderly widow, quietly enduring fines for having a modest bench installed for relief from arthritis, a family with a disabled child, forced into a financially ruinous sale because of arbitrary and aggressive fines, a Vietnam veteran whose service dog was dismissed as just a pet with fancy paperwork. The pattern was unmistakable, a systematic effort to make life unbearable for any resident whose needs deviated from the sanitized ideal of Suncrest Estates. Determined to confront this injustice head-on, Judge Caldwell assembled a legal team and sought mediation with the HOA. The meeting was arranged at the community center, a building that, ironically, was on the second floor of a structure that otherwise prided itself on accessibility. On the day of the meeting, despite the inconvenience and the palpable hostility, A few kind neighbors even helped him carry his wheelchair up the stairs. As he sat at the head of the conference table, his presence, a man of law and dignity, seemed to momentarily silence the room. But Valerie's response was chilling. "Everyone follows the same rules," she insisted. When Caldwell mentioned his federal background in disability law, she cut him off, dismissing his expertise with a snide remark that echoed in the minds of everyone present. "Former occupations are irrelevant here." The meeting ended with nothing more than an empty promise to review his case, and in the days that followed, every scheduled accommodation hearing was postponed or canceled without explanation. Meanwhile, the fines piled up and the harassment escalated to an almost unbearable level. It was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon that the situation reached its violent climax. That day, Caldwell had set up legal-grade surveillance cameras around his property. He knew that any evidence of wrongdoing would be crucial, not only for his own case, but for all the residents who had suffered silently. As he wheeled around his property, he noticed Valerie inspecting another resident's lawn. The tension was thick in the air. He approached her calmly, seeking to discuss the unreasonable violations. "You know," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within, "this equipment is medically necessary. It's protected by federal law." Valerie's face darkened instantly, and before anyone could react, she raised a heavy sledgehammer above his wheelchair. In a moment of unbridled fury, she brought it crashing down repeatedly. Each blow reverberated through the silent neighborhood, each strike a symbol of the systemic discrimination that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. The shock on the faces of the gathered neighbors was palpable. Some recorded the incident on their phones, while others stood frozen in disbelief. When the police and emergency services arrived, it was too late. The damage had been done. Caldwell's only means of mobility lay in ruins on the concrete, a testament to the cruelty of a woman who saw his disability not as a challenge to overcome, but as an aesthetic blemish to be eradicated. In the chaotic moments that followed, as the community struggled to process the brutality of what had just occurred, a cascade of support began to flow in. Neighbors, previously silenced by fear, stepped forward to share their own harrowing experiences of discrimination and harassment. The incident sparked outrage not only within Suncrest Estates, but across the nation. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and even state legislators began to take notice. Headlines blared the injustice, and what started as a single act of violence became a rallying cry for reform. Caldwell, despite his physical pain and the loss of his precious wheelchair, channeled his resolve into action. With the support of his legal team and former colleagues from the bench, he filed multiple federal civil rights claims. The overwhelming evidence, from surveillance footage to damning internal emails that exposed the HOA's deliberate targeting of disabled residents, formed an airtight case against the perpetrators. In court, the narrative was as clear as it was powerful. A community built on the promise of inclusivity had been hijacked by prejudice, led by a figure whose vision of perfection was tainted by discrimination. The trial, though lengthy and emotionally charged, ended in a historic victory. Valerie Harmon was held accountable for her actions, sentenced not only to a term behind bars, but also mandated to complete thousands of hours of community service at a local rehabilitation center. An ironic twist for someone who had so callously attacked the very symbol of independence. Months later, as Caldwell began his slow recovery, his story had already ignited change beyond Suncrest Estates. State legislators, inspired by the courageous stand of a man who had fought for the rights of millions, passed new housing equality and accessibility laws. These reforms introduced strict oversight of HOA practices, ensuring that no other community could become a breeding ground for discrimination. The incident not only fortified legal protections for disabled individuals, but also empowered residents nationwide to stand up for their rights. In the wake of the trial, a foundation was established in Caldwell's name, a beacon for housing equity. The settlement money was used to provide legal assistance to those facing housing discrimination, and the story of the destroyed wheelchair, captured in a now viral image of Valerie with her sledgehammer, became a powerful symbol. For millions, it served as a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, and that even in the face of systemic injustice, resilience and courage can spark monumental change. The story of Judge Robert Caldwell and his battle against an abusive HOA is more than just a tale of one man's misfortune. It's a stark reminder of the power of systemic discrimination, the importance of standing up for one's rights, and the potential for legal knowledge to turn the tide of injustice. Caldwell's experience teaches us that the law isn't just a set of rules, it's a powerful tool for change, one that must be wielded with both intelligence and compassion. For every person who has ever felt marginalized or powerless, this is a story of hope. It shows us that when communities come together and refuse to be silenced by prejudice, they can transform even the most vicious injustice into a catalyst for nationwide reform. And in the end, it reminds us that sometimes the very system built to protect us can be the battleground where true heroes emerge.